to have to ask this one what if question. What if Curious Office didn't exist and you had to reinvent your professional life from scratch? Like, what would you do? What would be the path that you would most likely go down?
I feel like we are at a really interesting juncture now where many people, in fairly straightforward terms, are going to need to decide that they're going to take the red pill or the blue pill.
Welcome to What If with Leslie Grandy. In this episode, we explore the importance of encouraging curiosity within organizations of all sizes, the challenges companies must deal with when evolving their culture in the face of disruptive new technologies, and the acceptance of risk and failure on the journey to deliver transformative change. We live in a moment where transformation is often framed as a technical problem. New tools arrive, new systems get installed, new competitors emerge, and then new problems arise. Organizations talk about digital transformation, AI transformation, and cultural transformation as if these are things you can simply roll out, train on, and check off a list. But real transformation doesn't begin with technology. It begins with a question. It begins with a willingness to be genuinely curious about what's actually happening inside an organization, inside a team, and even inside ourselves as leaders. This is not about treating curiosity as a personality trait, but curiosity as a practice, the kind that invites uncertainty instead of rushing past it, the kind that opens up space for uncomfortable conversations instead of smoothing them over, the kind that says, I don't fully understand this yet, and that's exactly where I want to start. Culture is often described as how we do things around here. But beneath that surface, culture is really about values and what we're allowed to question and what we're not. It's about whose voice gets to be heard and who gets to challenge the way things work. And also, over time, who learns it's just better to stay quiet. It's about whether bold ideas are treated as risks to manage or possibilities to explore, and whether the person who has a bold idea has to have a specific role. In fast-moving, technology-driven environments, especially now with AI reshaping what's possible almost weekly, that distinction becomes critical. Because the speed of change doesn't just pressure systems, it pressures people. It asks them to let go of expertise that once made them valuable. It asks them to step into problems that don't come with clear job descriptions, clear success metrics, or clear answers. That's where curiosity becomes more than a mindset. It becomes a form of operating mode. Curiosity is what allows a team to look at a process that works and still ask if it's serving the future they want to build. It's what gives people permission to open Pandora's box of ideas, knowing that not every question has to lead to an immediate solution. Sometimes it just needs to lead to a better understanding of the problem itself before designing the wrong solution. And there's a quiet courage in that, because asking better questions often feels riskier than proposing confident answers. Questions can expose gaps. They can surface tensions. They can reveal what we've been optimizing for might not actually be what matters most. This is especially true in moments of transformation. When organizations say they want to change, what they're often really saying is they want different outcomes. But different outcomes usually require different behaviors, different conversations, and different assumptions about who gets to shape the direction forward. So this is the space where my conversation with my guest, Kelly Smith, lives. It's about what it takes to build environments where people don't just follow plans, but participate in shaping them, where risk isn't framed only as the chance of failure, but also as the opportunity to learn something essential before it's too late, where technology, including AI, isn't treated as a shortcut to answers, but as a thought partner that can challenge how we see problems in the first place. At its core, this is a conversation about agency, about what happens when people feel they are allowed to ask, what if we did this differently? And trust that the question itself won't be punished. Because transformation happens when a culture shifts from protecting what it already knows to being curious about what it doesn't. And we're going to cover a small but important part of that terrain today. I hope you enjoy this episode of What If with Leslie Grandy. My guest today is Kelly Smith, a digital innovation leader and entrepreneur who's built and led product and technology teams at companies like Starbucks, Athletic Greens, MGM Resorts, and Haggerty. He's also the founder of Curious Office, a seed stage incubator where early ideas get tested, shaped, and sometimes completely reinvented. What I love most about Kelly's work is that it just doesn't focus on what teams build, but how they work. He brings product engineering and culture together to help organizations grow in fast-moving, technology-driven environments. Today, we're going to talk about what it really takes to drive transformation, build resilient teams, chase ambitious goals, and lead with intention in a world where technology, and now AI, is constantly changing the rules. Welcome to the podcast, Kelly. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Leslie. It's great to see you again. It's been a long time.
It has. It's terrific to be able to connect with you in this context because I really want to pick your brain on a lot of topics. Although we haven't worked together, we have several connections in common. So I've tracked your very successful career for a while now. And I know you've led digital transformation inside some very large organizations. When you first step in, what does the as-is reality usually look like? And what tends to be the hardest barrier to moving the organization forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's interesting because those jobs, they have digital in the title. And so I suppose it would be natural for folks to think that the crux of it is really digital or it's fundamentally about software, that kind of thing. And to some degree, I think that's true. But my own experience was that, oftentimes it's not, things don't sort of move at the speed of digital in that context. And a lot of what you're trying to work through is oftentimes cultural, could be sort of DNA. It could be, earning trust at the upper levels. Obviously, in all companies, there's a sort of corporate political aspect to things. And I think that all of those other elements for me sort of stand out in my memory as being just much more than I might have expected before sort of getting into the companies and, getting into building cool products and engineering and design and everything else. Obviously, that's still important. It's a key part of it, but the people who are really successful in those roles understand all the non-digital parts of the digital transformation agenda.
That's really interesting because I'm curious, what are the signs that you look for early on when you enter a company that they're ready to walk the walk and that they support bold thinking that will be necessary to make a successful transformation? And what do you look for that they've demonstrated that willingness?
This is going to be an indirect answer to your question, but I'll tell you something interesting. I don't remember getting a very crisp job description when I started as the chief digital officer at Athletic Greens or MGM Resorts or Haggerty. That might have just been a coincidence, but it turned out to be perfect. For most people, I would say that kind of job description is less than ideal. Like, what are my responsibilities? What do you expect of me and so forth? But for me personally, it's absolutely perfect. So I'll sort of start with that. What stands out to me was actually, I remember the first week I was at MGM Resorts and I was sort of getting a tour around the Bellagio with the president of the Bellagio. And this was at one of those times where there's a whole bunch of people sort of stacked up in the lobby waiting to get to the front desk to check in. You've been in tech a long time, so you remember during like trade show days and stuff like that. Trade show weeks is just is packed, right? And I asked him, what is everyone doing here in the lobby, standing there in those queues and those lines? And he looked at me like I was crazy. It's like, well, they're waiting to check in. And I remember thinking, well, what magical thing happens when it's your turn, right? Like what exactly is going on that requires people to do this? And of course, it's things like finding a room and assigning a room and giving you a key, right? And it turns out those are all things that can be automated. And so that wasn't even the first thing on my mind that I thought I would be thinking about or kind of doing in the first few weeks. But we're like, gee, people can use their phone to check in. People can use their phone to open the door, right? So providing that kind of optionality, it's a little bit opportunistic. But in closing, to answer your question, I think those roles work so much better when you go in speaking of curious office, you go in with immense amounts of curiosity because oftentimes that's actually what they need the most, even if they don't tell you that.
That's really interesting. You mentioned something in the beginning of that, and I want to kind of peel it back a layer. What about you personally makes that kind of circumstance where you don't have a job description and you're not sure where's the first place you need to attack because there's so many places that would benefit from you attacking them? What about you makes you really good at that kind of a role?
You know, I was telling my wife the other day that I think it's just good fortune, but everything happening in the world of AI, for example, I think coincidentally just plays well into how I like to be at work and in life. The Curious Office name, which goes now all the way back to 2007, was not at all by accident. That name came from an observation that I had amongst my friends in Seattle who were immensely successful. And I was thinking, what can I put one thing? What is the one thing that the common thread across all of those individuals that I can put my finger on that brought them so much success? And I'm thinking about people like Rich Barton, the founder of Expedia and Zillow. Adrian Hanauer is one of my oldest friends, now the owner of the Seattle Sounders, and many others. And if I was forced to choose one thing, it was, obsessive levels of curiosity compared to most people. The second thing I think is also important, but I really prioritize the interest and curiosity. The second thing was a very healthy relationship with risk. But at the core, that's really just kind of it. I find myself just kind of walking around wondering, why is this way? And in general, I have a distrust and verify sort of approach to like the world around me because I'm convinced that the world around you and me is probably not even at all what we think it is. And now I'm getting into like the quantum part of what we think is the fabric of reality. So if you start there and you just kind of work backwards, it's pretty easy to start asking really simple questions when nobody expects that.
That's great. That was such a rich answer. It's two branches I'm going to go down. So I'm going to come back to one part that you said about risk. But before I do, I love your emphasis on curiosity. And I'm just curious myself how you see an organization reflect that in their norms and their behaviors. And how does that inform their willingness to take the risk necessary to make the changes that you want to see? So, what cultural grounding has to happen for people to feel comfortable asking questions, opening up, Pandora's box of ideas and things, and then be comfortable to act and move them forward? So, what is it that you see that makes that work in an organization or a team?
I think there's two parts. The first part is that larger organizations, I'm thinking of Starbucks now, very understandably, they operate on the basis of data, right? And data is great. Data is obviously powerful. Data is foundational. But in general, pattern matching and sort of intuition isn't something that the rank and file are often afforded within those corporate environments. And I think that pattern matching and intuition is really important to asking the questions that weren't asked at all. So that's kind of the first part I would say. And the next thing that you're sort of looking for is that, org structures and corporations both serve them well and work against them all at the same time. Because many times the people with the right kind of persona to be disruptive in a healthy way are sitting in the wrong place in the organization. They're not empowered to really drive that quality change. They might not have the right job title, right? And I was always less interested in those details. When you hear about these big consulting companies saying digital transformation can be really hard and it can be emotionally stressful and it can be this, those are the reasons why, right? You pull people forward who show promise as individuals and they show unique ways of thinking, but maybe they're too junior or they're, not don't have the right title. People feel like they didn't earn the right to have those ideas. Those are all things that challenge a company as they're trying to reinvent themselves. So yeah, I think it's those two things.
As a leader, what do you do to encourage those people that you talk about? I think it's a really important point you make. So I want to kind of circle it for a second, which is not everybody thinks they can be creative in the job that they have, or that they're allowed to ask those bold, open-ended questions about what if we did things differently or challenge the status quo. So as a leader, what do you do? How do you solicit that? How do you encourage that? What are the kind of techniques or the behaviors that you demonstrate to invite those people forward? How do you get them to act?
We can be inspired by some very successful people and work backwards to an answer. Let's just for fun, let's go ahead and just play this game together. When you think about, let's take really famous people everybody knows. Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. Elon Musk, the founder of many companies. Kevin Systrom, the founder of Instagram. Stuart Butterfield, the founder of Slack. What would we call those people? In a corporate context, are they engineers? I'd say no. Are they product managers? I'd say no. Are they designers? I'd say no. Are they general managers? Maybe, right? And so when you dissect the people changing our future, right, with us, what you observe is, oh, well, wait a second. They don't actually fit cleanly in any of these corporate buckets, right? And so what's going on here? And here's a follow-up point. What did Elon Musk even know about electric cars? Close to zero, probably. What did he know about rockets? Close to zero. And people are missing this incredible lesson right in front of their own eyes, which is you didn't need to know. You'll learn what you need to learn. And in a corporate world, that way of thinking, that kind of behavior, that request and expectation of people should be provoked, right? So you can start to surface those people who, are the gifted polymaths that might have been locked or tucked away in a corner. That's what you're really looking for.
And so you meet the team, you ask these provocative questions, and you kind of get a sense quickly as to whether someone's willing to go down that path with you with an open and creative mind to what that might lead to, versus someone who stays more linear, sort of in the lane. Is that how you would say it when you talk about the provocations?
Yes, absolutely. And I would say that I'm sure you're not surprised that not everybody sort of recognizes that opportunity and welcomes it, because a lot of people want to know what their task is. They want to know what they're supposed to do from 9 to 5. They want to go home. They're not on this sort of generalized intellectual pursuit of the world around them, right? Some people are, some people aren't. I have never been successful telling someone work harder. I've never been successful telling someone think harder. I think people are going to have to learn, by the way, because, I'm sure we'll get into AI here at some point. People are going to have to learn what I'm saying right now, but that will be upon many people, that will be forced upon them, because the definitions of their roles in the next 24 months are going to fundamentally change. So when you're forced, then you might go do things that are uncomfortable. And that's what's on everyone's doorstep right now, or virtually everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue to the question that I had about how does AI, in the context of an AI related transformation. Now we're trying to be a company that embraces AI, but we might have had some cultural flaws before we decided to do that. Now, what does AI do to impact the culture? And what do leaders do when they make that decision to kind of go AI or deploy AI in a more broad sense? What does that do to people who maybe were already struggling with the change that was required in the digital transformation sense? And now they have this whole other layer on top of it to affect how they do their job or what's expected of them. What is it going to be doing to culture to introduce AI into something that was already perhaps a struggle for people to transform before AI?
Well, for sure, it is going to amplify the challenge in humans in the workforce in the way that I just described. So it's going to basically take that dynamic, and it's going to really, really amplify it, right? What I would really tell people, really starting now, first of all, I've been doing this working in tech, if you will, since the dawn of the web browser. My very first company was the first commercial web browser based in Seattle. And I have never seen anything like what I'm seeing right now. It's this case of change is, I'm seeing big differences now because I'm really kind of deep in the weeds. I'm seeing it, weekly to bi-weekly. What people have to do within the corporate world, I think, first of all, especially in leadership roles, is accept the world for what it is now. Don't wish for a different world, because this is happening. Everybody has to figure out how to deal with it, right? And so what's going to happen is, first of all, two things, and I'll stop, take a breath. One is that for sure, fewer people are going to be able to do the work of much larger teams starting now, not next year. You're going to see in the second half of 2026 more and more and more announcements about, slower hiring, people doing more with less. Then the next thing that's going to happen is that job descriptions, as you and I knew them, and I mean like product managers, front-end developers, back-end developers, graphic designers, project managers, business analysts, those roles are all going to change. And so companies that are wise, in my opinion, are having, the leaders should be having a one-on-one with themselves and then with each other, sort of saying, oh, we're not speculating. This is going to happen. And it's not 2 years, right? So tremendous opportunity. But if people also aren't scared, I don't think they get it.
Made me think of a couple of different questions as you were going there. The first one is, when you see now what AI is doing to businesses large and small, obviously the startup pipeline that includes a lot more AI. I kind of want to pivot to how you look at early ideas and early founders and decide what they're doing, especially with emerging technology like AI, is actually worth your time, is actually worth committing your effort to, because there's so many things that are now possible because of AI, but just because you can do them doesn't make them valuable. So how do you make that choice now? Because I can be a vibe coder as a product manager, and I can make an application or an agent tomorrow. But how do you know, just because somebody does the thing, builds the thing, or can build the thing, that their idea is worth pursuing?
That's a really good question. And in many ways, I think it gets to the heart of the matter, if you will. And what I mean by that is, when you wanted to invest in a company 10 years ago, of course, one of the criteria was, are they smart? And in those days, the definition of smart in large part was they were great developers, they were technically minded, they might have had a math or a physics background, et cetera, right? In our industry. But the problem is that much of what the human race defined as smart is now being rewritten, because ironically, the very first things to be commoditized are those things that we used to think smart people did. You need to be looking for people who are paying attention, who see what's going on, and they're going through the process of reinventing themselves. And what that's going to mean is people who become exceptional pattern matchers that basically triangulate business opportunity with technology and timing, so that they are unusually positioned to take full advantage of this thing called AI. Make no mistake. So I live in this every single day. I have a team of developers, and some of them, even to this day, after talking to me every day, are really slow to embrace the thing that you would have thought a senior developer wants to embrace. That's not a default truth at all. Not at all. I'm not seeing it. I'm seeing more resistance on average than deep excitement and embracing. So that's where people will find leverage in this new world, both executives and workers. But I highly suggest people start breaking down what it means for them tomorrow. Don't think this is going to be something you can put this off until 2 years from now. I don't think that would be wise.
I totally agree. When I hear you talking, though, I wonder, do you see the type of environment, i.e., a large corporation like an MGM or a Starbucks, or the startup that you're coaching. Do you see that environment change your personal approach to problem solving or solution design? Or do you do what you do regardless of the scale of the environment or the resources available?
It's a really good question because I need to look in the mirror myself and I need to ask myself whether or not I'm an ideal person to be within large companies trying to drive this kind of change. And the true answer is probably not, right? When I first started at Starbucks, if I were to be honest with you, it was actually an exercise in curiosity because I didn't even know if I would survive or thrive inside of a big company. I had no clue. What I learned was that I began to appreciate the qualities in certain kinds of people that can really navigate big corporate environments and they do it well. Even certain people in my mind are popping into my head right now. And I remember thinking, wow, this person is brilliant for this setting, right? I was always a disruptive one. There's a part of, when I spend time with people now based on my journey, I really, 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 really try to get them to think about their intuition because our intuition's telling us all something. And I'm not sure that more than 50% of the people listen to their intuition. I'm not convinced that that's true. And for a while, I didn't. I think I was able to add value nevertheless, but I wouldn't say that I was sort of ideally suited for it within a large corporation. I'm much more suited for what I'm doing now. Took a long time to get there.
And that's because you have a different view of the resources, constraints, and landscape that you're operating in, or it's because you feel like you have less political forces that you have to contend with that might block your vision. What part what part of what you're doing now makes you more suited than the success that you had at large companies?
I think it's probably, two things. Number one is to do well in a large corporation, you must have a level of patience and indeed appreciation for, for lack of a better word, for a kind of political dynamic that's necessary for you to excel at inside of a large company. That's the first part. And the second part is that this is why I said the AI is kind of like playing into like my way of being, which is an accident, but just am deeply interested in first principles thinking and being fixated on what's true, right? Not what everybody's saying or not what people wished was true, but that's my personal interest in terms of the way I want to be in the world. Deeply curious, cognizant every day of my limited time on this planet, ferocious about learning because at the end of the day, for me, that's what's fun. And I've come to a place now where I feel like, you know what? AI makes this even more fun for me because it's no longer an excuse to say, well, I don't know how to do that. Or the classic corporate one, you don't have the experience. Remember those classic lines of thinking about who deserved a promotion and who didn't? Well, now it's like every answer to every question that you're going to have exists. Your level of creativity to get to the truest answer will be what defines how successful you are. Meaning, I'm not one of those people that complains about prompts occasionally returning inaccurate facts. I'm interested in triangulating with all the capability in getting to what's probably the truest thing. That is not necessarily what's going to make you, successful for 20 years at Starbucks.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of What If with Leslie Grandy. If you'd like to learn more about how we can work together to expand your organization's capacity to innovate, to leverage AI as a strategic thought partner, and to inspire your teams to think bigger and take intelligent risks, visit lesliegrandy.com today. I hear you. I think another version of that, at least my interaction with AI, is when I get an answer I don't expect or that may be flawed, I actually ask how that answer made sense to them. So I want to learn how AI actually itself puts together the answer so that not just challenging the answer at its face value, but maybe the thinking pattern is something I need to understand to see how it came up with that answer. So I do feel like even being curious about how AI produces a response has helped me learn more about what the tool is useful for, but also what I can use of the tool to supplement my own thinking patterns. So it's really nice to see how it actually may attack a problem differently.
Exactly right. Kind of tying this back into the corporate thing, I think that if you picture yourself around a big conference table, let's say in a typical corporate world, in general, not always, but in general, pointing out where someone who's in a position of power is wrong in front of the rest of the room, that's not generally a successful tactic. But for me, I truly love being wrong. I'm only interested in what's true. I don't care. I would rather be wrong, actually, because if I have a blind spot and I don't know about it, it really bothers me. I don't know what advice I would give to people necessarily sort of now based on my own personal journey, but I would absolutely encourage people to sort of sit down and just sort of think like, hey, take a deep breath, right? And let's all remember our life is finite here. Like, is it possible your intuition is telling you something today or yesterday that maybe you're not listening to or you haven't been listening to, right? Because let's be honest, the problem with the world for workers, I think in many ways is they feel like they have no choice, which is the financial needs we all have to take care of our family. That gets into the whole risk, your relationship with risk. So it's a super, super serious and challenging balance. But I think in the end of the day, what ultimately wins if you allow enough time is listening to your intuition and sort of trying to adopt a way of thinking where you see the world through a lens of first principles first, and then just start doing that, start thinking that way every day and build your career around how that works.
With risk, I think a lot of people are afraid of risk because they're afraid of failure, and they see risk as introducing a probability around failure, right? Whatever that probability is, it may even be a small probability, but in a corporate environment, a probability of failure is a failure of performance, or at least perceived as a failure of performance. How do you deal with failure, and what role has failure played in your journey as an executive, a founder, and also an investor? Like, has it changed how you thought about failure? Has it just gotten more concrete in your mind that failure plays a particular role? How do you think about it?
Failure is actually kind of an interesting word. For example, what if we just take a minute for a second and say, hold on a second, what does it mean exactly? I mean, what's the definition of this word? Because sometimes people conflate it with things didn't turn out the way I expected, right? But what's the technical definition of the word? The technical definition of the word goes all the way back to the days of like practically when we can track humans, and it had a literal definition which was physical, to stumble or trip. And I think what I see in business a lot is that we use the word failure kind of incorrectly almost, which is to say that, because someone couldn't interpret the future, they failed. And I think there's a nuance that's really, really important there, right? You can have an intuition about what the future will support in terms of a startup. And you can sort of do your best to try to triangulate like why you think now is the right time and why you think this is going to be the right product that the market's going to react favorably to. But what you can't do is assure your investors that you know the future, right? So what you're looking for is really high quality failures from people where they stumbled and tripped and dealt with that really well. But you're not looking for like, gee, you should have known, you should have known exactly what 2028 is going to be all about. I don't really fault people for things like that. The failures that stand out to me are ones where I literally knew better. I didn't listen to my intuition. I did it anyway, right? I didn't need to look into the future. It was something about that moment in time. I knew that I shouldn't have done that. Those failures really bother me.
That's a really great follow-up question I want to ask, which I think we all have moments in our career where we feel that way, right? Like it was on us, our ownership of that, not working out, definition of failure, whatever we thought was something that we wanted to achieve that we couldn't and we failed to achieve. But can you think of any particular pivot point or tipping point that was around a failure that changed how you think about the work that you do, that changed how you approach risk or anything? Was there any failure that you remember that sort of stands out in your mind in your leadership journey that really colored the future going forward for you? And I mean in a positive way, something that you thought because of that, you're going to learn and bounce forward in a specific way.
Yeah, I actually think about this one a lot. And I don't even know that it's the best failure story, but what I'm about to tell you is what I find myself thinking about the most in terms of failures. What I find myself thinking about the most is that I didn't prioritize my coworkers' well-being over business performance all the time. To me, that's a failure that really bothers me, and it didn't require that I knew what was going to happen in the future. There are many situations where I'd go back in time and I'd say, wow, if you could have had both business success and maintained your relationship with this person had you just, you know, taken a deep breath, or had you just sort of looked at the big picture, or had you remembered what you always tell yourself, which is this is a finite life we all have, right? Damaging personal relationships over business pursuits is just the stupidest thing. And those are the ones that really weigh on me, kind of even to this day. Just where I made conduct choices that were far from flattering.
I totally get that because, again, that's something in your control, right? That's something you could have controlled and made a choice, right? That you were going to do that. So now that you're more sensitive to that, what happens when you have an employee, like you talked about, an engineer or a founder that you're backing, and you see they resist your feedback or customer feedback or market signals? How do you step in to give them the confidence to chase a vision that addresses those things, right? And a lot of time, they're going to hold on to that idea with clenched fists and not take your feedback or an employee or customer input. So what do you do so that you can preserve the relationship, build their confidence, but get them past that sort of blocker?
Over the last month, I've been kind of going through something similar where, within our own development team, there have been people who I think were surprisingly sort of slow to like really jump into this whole AI dialogue and say, let's figure out what it means for us. And then there were other people who just sort of quietly listened with a great deal of humility that I think, was intriguing to me, and it created a personal chemistry between me and that person. I started to sort of appreciate personal chemistry. It's really, really hard to have an incredibly productive relationship with someone else that you don't have chemistry with, which doesn't make them good or bad necessarily half the time, right? Everyone's entitled to an opinion and a thought. But it's hard to excel with team members with whom you don't have a personal chemistry. It's a non-obvious point, I think, but
So when you're looking for people to back and products and ideas to back, that's a factor for you, right? Is whether or not you actually envision having chemistry that will carry you through those tough times.
100%, because, we can all think of brilliant people who you recognize they're brilliant, incredibly gifted on any measure, but doesn't necessarily mean you want to spend their Sunday afternoon with them for whatever your own reasons, right? So I do think that's important. And I think for me, just to kind of go a little bit further on that, and I'll sort of stop, is I really feel like everybody has something to teach me, and I'm curious to find out what it is. I personally found myself getting frustrated if I feel like that same level of listening or curiosity kind of wasn't reciprocated kind of on the other side. So as an investor, if you're investing in a company, but you sort of feel like they're really just not going to regard any of your opinions, right? That creates a really unhealthy tension, I would say. There's an ego thing to that, right? Which is like prioritize curiosity over personal ego 100% of the time. And I don't always do it, but I really, really try hard because I know it's the way that I want to be.
I have to ask this one what if question. What if Curious Office didn't exist and you had to reinvent your professional life from scratch? Like, what would you do? What would be the path that you would most likely go down?
I feel like we are at a really interesting juncture now where many people in fairly straightforward terms are going to need to decide that they're going to take the red pill or the blue pill. The red pill is things AI can't do. Be a sports car mechanic, repair watches, start a roofing company, buy a plumbing company from someone who wants to retire. You're going to see this huge influx from the professional world into the trades in the next, 3 years. The blue pill is one where you basically say, okay, I love my career as a graphic designer, let's just say, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be pushing pixels the way you have been for the last, 10 or 20 years, because the pixels don't want you to push them. They don't need you to push them anymore. And so your value is going to be taste, curation, strategy mapping to business outcomes, because you don't need to do the silly things that we've all been doing for so many years, right? And by the way, they're really, half the stuff we've been doing, thank God, they are really, really silly. Using the graphic design example, a lot of people don't know this. It's crazy. We've been doing this for decades, but if you believe that there are a lot of screens in the world of different shapes and sizes, well, don't you find it curious, speaking of asking why, don't you find it curious that design tools don't just let you make one screen and then automatically just repurpose its layout for all the other screens on Earth? So instead, what have we been doing for years? You make 7 different versions of the same screen just to hand to a developer who, by the way, newsflash, they don't even recreate it the way you did. All they can do is look at the picture. These are examples of things like, in the context of the blue pill, if people want to stay in that world, your job description is just going to absolutely change. And it doesn't matter if you're a product manager, a developer, a designer, or a business analyst, or a QA tester. It's all going to change.
So are you going to take the red pill or the blue pill if you can't do Curious Office?
I am 110% deeply interested in where all of this goes with AI, even though I would love to, and I think I would thoroughly enjoy owning a big landscaping company or something like that. But for now, that's kind of my choice because it's so disruptive and I'm so curious about where's all this going to go? And why not? Let's think about it. Let's start together with a question we might ask ourselves. Do you think it is true or not true, Leslie, that AI will drive job compression significantly in the next 24 months? And probably it'll start to manifest itself earliest in those entry-level jobs. Do you feel like that's true or not true?
I think that's true. I think there's truth in that.
I agree. Which then begs the curious question, and this is why I'm so interested. What then are people supposed to do? Here's what I hear most frequently. I hear most frequently, let's use an analogy where you and I kind of came from. They said, you might remember this, by the way, at Real Networks, they said, well, streaming audio is not going to kill the radio. Remember that? It's like, well, yeah, actually, it kind of did. It just took a little longer than you thought, right? The Seattle Times newspaper, what's different about AI than all those other analogies where these evolutions did indeed create more jobs? What's different is you can't compare these things because the fundamental nature of AI actually is about elimination, right? And that was never really, nothing else really compares. So I agree with you. I think that's what's going to happen. So now I'm curious about, well, then what? What are we supposed to do about it? And I'm interested in helping people understand, because I have a front row seat. Like, well, the part of the what is, just because you're a senior developer does not mean you're going to get the maximum out of AI such that you're going to be protected. Why? Because it turns out the best users of AI think completely differently than the developer in most cases. It's like the return of the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, what was he? He was like a painter, he was a sculptor, he was an architect, he was like all these things. And we made up this term, the Renaissance type individual. The value is going to flow to those people who have that natural propensity. And those are going to be the new roles, but you just have to figure out how do you teach more people to do that. And that's really hard.
Yeah, and actually, I think just to dwell on the teach more people to do that, I've been working on teaching people how to use AI as a thought partner, not as a tool or an efficiency gain, but to actually have the kind of conversation. And you had said earlier how people don't like to go against the leader in the room if they have a different idea or they think they have a better idea. Well, the best place to actually have that debate is with AI, because they're not attached to your idea or their own. And so to explore your idea more fully, to think it through in more expansive terms with analogies from other domains or patterns that you wouldn't recognize across other systems that have similar functionality, you're now all of a sudden accelerating your problem solving skills rather than looking for the answer, right? Because you're looking at it in a thought provoking way. And what I find when I teach people to do this is this aha moment that they never thought that AI was that type of partner, that type of collaborator that could challenge not only their own thinking, but give them more inputs to expand their thinking. And I realized in those classes, people weren't taught how to think in school, except around things like data and analytics. How do you think about those things, right? How do you think about how a brand works? But it's very specific and applied thinking, right? It's not how do you solve problems? And there are all sorts of definitions for problems. And so I agree with you that the capacity that AI has to actually amplify your problem solving capacity, or even amplify your confidence in tackling things in your job that you might not have had to do before, is really an important role, but it's not one we've taught people, right? They don't know how to think around a problem when it's unstructured and when there's all this insight, and they kind of lean back into the data as hindsight telling me what to do as I think forward. Are you seeing that sort of, again, that sort of challenge in thinking, not by looking back at what past performance tells us, but what the future now enables?
100%. And to give a very specific example, when you have people who've been working in technology for a long time who are somewhat dismissive of, let's say, AI coding, as an example, because maybe they got a result that was unfavorable, right? My experience has been that a traditional way of thinking is yielding those results, but it is unknowns to them. What do I mean by that? Let's say that you have a very complex spec that you're trying to work on, right? And you're working with AI to write the very complex spec that a coder or an implementation agent is going to go do. Well, I sort of figured out that when AI thinks it's done, if you care about quality, that's when the top tier, that's when the person who's really on their game thinks the job starts. Because I now can think of 25 techniques to provoke the AI into improving the quality of the spec, right? It won't just go there automatically. And I don't trust the quality of every single answer until I triangulate like crazy. But how you triangulate like crazy? Honestly, it's something that you have to learn how to do. What most people do, just their whole approach, this is education, by the way, for the kind of education that will be valuable in the future, is people go straight to code because AI wants to go straight to code. And I tell everybody, like, nope, you do that last. You debug documentation, not code. Why? Because it's less destructive. And when people think their specs are perfect, it's now easier for me to kind of come in and show you, like, no, you have 50 things you didn't consider in this spec that are going to create a problem. And if I were to be honest, that's actually also why we get bad software the old way, because people weren't asking the right questions. People built things assuming too much. Questions weren't asked at all, and therefore things got left out. It's no different, to be honest with you. The fact that someone understood every line of code turns out not to have been the important part. The important part was, yeah, but did you build the right thing? And is it great? It's not important that you understood every line of code. That wasn't even the yardstick of success.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love the idea also that that you're expecting iteration as part of your AI engagement, and so therefore you should expect iteration in your team members. You should accept not the first answer, but the proof that that first answer is the one that you should pursue. That's what I hear you saying, and I really love that.
And people are critical, about, well, look at what it did. Look at what AI did. And my response to that is, if they got a response that they know is not true, people love to latch on to like replies where they know like that's just not true. My response to that is, well, hold on a second. Was there ever a time in your life where a response you got from the news or from a Google search was 100% right? Like, this is no different. You don't judge Google because, you know, it served you an ad that you don't love or that the first search result wasn't exactly what you were looking for. But the scarier part to me is don't even bother judging it by what you see today. Like, wait 3 weeks, wait 6 months. That's how you should be thinking. Like, don't worry about it. That's going to solve itself. The real issue is, are you going to reinvent yourself the next 6 months? That's a lot harder than the AI getting better, better quality results in 6 months, because you can just count on that. It's going to happen. So I don't know about you, but the last 5 years of my life went by really quickly.
Oh, absolutely. And even just the last year of my AI use, when I was writing the book, I had a logic puzzle and I put it into AI because I figured that's what somebody who reads the book would do, to see if AI would figure it out. And it had like 15 facts. And the question was sort of like, who lives in the red house? And when I gave the problem to AI, it stopped with the first answer it got with only using 12 of the facts. It decided 3 of the facts weren't necessary. And I learned in that process that I have to be specific to tell it, use all of these facts because I'm looking for an answer that includes them all. And when I saw the wrong answer, I realized it was my flaw, not AI's flaw, that I wasn't more instructive, that every fact had to be considered. And so the second time I did it, I didn't do it either. And I just curious what it would do if I did it again. And it just ignored 2 different facts and came up with another answer. Neither of those were wrong answers, given that my prompt didn't say every single fact had to be considered. So the other part I think that you're making is, wrong or mistaken is sometimes contextual to how the prompt was even crafted, right? And where you pointed AI.
I would argue it's even more nuanced than that. And here's why. Because these tools were created by people, my experience is that they have manifestations like people also. Here's what I mean. If you're a really great top tier product manager in a company, let's say, but you're stuck in a 2-hour meeting with your executive team and you're expected to capture everything, humans, as you know, oftentimes like, oh, you forgot that one thing. Oh, you forgot that one thing. Well, guess what? AI works identically. So it will forget things like a person. It was built by a person. And so it can't hang on to every fact, even if you think, well, I wrote this and I told you to consider it, and now you're not. It's like the expectation should be it acts more like a human than you think, right? It's going to forget things. There are techniques to improve that, just like there are techniques people can use to improve their own memory. But I do not default to it remembered what I said. I find that fascinating, by the way, because I've noticed this real subtlety where it's like, oh, you just like a person, like you're forgetting or you assumed something. That's another one. Assumptions.
Yeah. Yep. And I also do feel there's an attempt to create a relationship with me by how kind the answers are often, or how the feedback comes back to me like, that's strong, but I can help you make it stronger, so that I'm more accepting of the output, because it seems to come in the guise that isn't necessarily what I might see in a meeting room, right? Where someone will push back on my idea in a completely different way for a different reason, right? How it affects their job, or how it affects the work that they were doing and are fearful that work will change. So my idea doesn't look as good to them. And so I think sometimes I want that actual pushback, so I understand what the failure cases would be in reality. And AI doesn't recognize that. And so it's attempting to be my friend or collaborator in that way without really sort of calling me out. And I think that's a weakness in terms of my dependence on the output, without really challenging myself in that conversation, right? Without really making sure that AI isn't trying to just perform for me, like you said, like a human who wants to be liked and reused.
For better or worse, I agree. And for better or worse, I fully expect the performance of the AI, probably in the next 12 to 24 months, to also the quality of its responses, if I had to guess, will also hinge on its relationship with you. So
Totally.
if you're mean and dismissive and everything else, it's not really happening right now that I can tell, but I fully expect that if it's not gelling with you and the chemistry doesn't exist in the conversation, you're just not going to get great results. Now that's scary to think about.
Yeah, totally. That
But
judgment, that judgment coming back out of the machine will really, I think, throw people off when that happens. But I agree with you. I think it's around the corner.
yeah, which kind of makes sense, right? In the big picture, it's actually all of this is kind of making sense in the big picture, even though it's incredibly curious. But we've all been connected to the machine for what, 3 decades now, feeding in everything we know and everything we want and and so we're all millions of people feeding in, billions of people feeding in for decades and decades. So what's happening is a lot of this should make sense to us, which is why I do think these personality subtleties are going to start coming out, right? Because it's just drawing on humanity. Kind of crazy, but yeah, we are where we are. It's the world in which we live.
Well, I am so delighted that we had this time together. I really enjoyed the walk we took. It really covered a lot of interesting territory, and I'm a particular fan of your commitment to curiosity. I love that. So I wanted to have you on the podcast. It's one of the things that I really appreciate about what you bring to the work that you do. So thank you so much for joining me today, Kelly. I really appreciate it. If people want to learn more about Curious Office or the work that you do, what should they do?
They can just email me, kelly@curiousoffice.com, or my personal email address is just my name, kellysmith@kellysmith.com. I'm checking them many times all throughout the day, and anybody who reaches out, I'll absolutely reply one way or the other. So really appreciate it, and I must say that you're a great podcasting host. You're actually a natural, so you're far too humble.
Well, thanks so much, Kelly. I really appreciate your help in making this episode memorable. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today for What If with Leslie Grandy. You've been listening to What If with Leslie Grandy. If you want to learn more about creative leadership in the age of generative AI, subscribe to my Substack at lesliegrandy.substack.com.